Now, before we get started, I'll give you a bit of idea of how I conducted my test. Basically, I suspended my Razer Siren Pro microphone about 2 feet above the keyboards, just out of frame of the camera. I put the mic here just to kind of approximate where most people's heads are going to be sitting when they're actually using the keyboard. And then I marked the space on my desk where the keyboards would sit, just so that I could try and guarantee that I was always pointing roughly in the same area, so that I didn't accidentally make one of the keyboards sound louder or quieter than the others without realizing. Now, I'm not going to go into the feel of the keyboards in this one. This is purely a sound comparison, because that's completely just a whole nother can of worms, and that's a whole video in itself. So maybe I'll do a video on that later on, further down the track. But for now, we're just concerning ourselves with the sound that these keyboards make relative to each other. Now, keep in mind when you're looking at these numbers that I'm about to show you that we're metering this in dBFS. That's decibels relative to full scale. What that means is that 0 dB is the loudest sound can possibly get before it distorts our recorder, and all of our recordings should appear as a negative reading below that. So the closer they are to 0, the louder they are. We're going to record 2 passes of each keyboard, one which is just a standard sort of typing kind of speed and volume, and the next is just full-on turbo mode, where we'll just put it under a torture test and see how loud we can really get it to sound. This should hopefully give you an idea of the range and volume to expect from the keyboard. So with that out of the way, let's begin. And there we go. Now I'll give you a chance to adjust your volume settings if you need to before we go back into the rest of the video, because it may be a little bit louder. Now here we go with the results. Now as you can see, the Cherry MX Silent was by far the quietest keyboard that we tested, and the Razer Green and MX Blue were the loudest that we looked at. Now I know a lot of you are probably thinking, how can it be that there's only 3 dBs of difference in volume between the Razer Green switches and the Cherry MX Browns when you're actually listening to it, when you're in the room with them, they sound far louder. Now, the reasons for this are kind of complex, so I won't go into too much detail, but I will give you a quick overview of why that might be. So first of all, let's get some perspective here. In order to double the perceived volume of a sound, we need to add 10 dBs. So for every 10 dBs we're adding, that's a 100% increase in volume. So that means that there's about 30% volume difference between the Razer Greens and the Cherry MX Browns. Now granted, 30% is a reasonable increase, but it still sounds much louder, so let's look at another reason why that might be. Now, years ago, before I decided to waste my life on video games, I actually got a diploma in audio engineering, and something that one of my tutors said to me once has stuck with me for a very long time because I thought it was quite interesting. We were learning about humans and how we can perceive different frequencies at different volumes. For instance, a low frequency sound may sound quieter than a high frequency sound even though the actual volume of them is identical. There's a couple reasons for this, and one of them is that your brain actually prioritizes and handles sounds differently depending on how urgent it thinks you need to hear them. The reason for this is that our ancestors relied on these different frequencies in order to keep themselves alive. Being a caveman was probably a pretty hard life, always being on the lookout for danger and threats. So over the course of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, we basically evolved these little flappy ears on the side of our head that are perfectly tuned, every ridge, every contour in them, in order to accentuate frequencies that are important to us. So as it actually turns out, there's a couple key frequency ranges that the human ear is tuned to pick up on the most. The first range is where the human voice sits, and probably a lot of animal sounds and things like that as well. So that's not really relevant to what we're talking about, but obviously it was important that these early cavemen could communicate with each other. The second range, which is what's relevant to what we're talking about here, is high frequency, short, sharp sounds. So these short, sharp sounds, for example, something like a twig snapping, are usually the kind of thing that precede death for a caveman. So naturally, the cavemen with ears attuned to these sounds survived a lot longer than the others, and that's how we sort of evolved down the line to get to where we are today. And I know we went a little bit deep on that one, and I know there's a lot to digest there, but essentially that is the reason why these short, sharp, clicky sounds coming out of our Cherry MX Blue and Razer Green keyboards seem to stick out so much and seem to sound so much louder than they really are. So next time your partner is yelling at you because they can't get to sleep when they're in the next room and you're tapping away at your Razer Black Widow or other clicky keyboard, just remind them that the keyboard isn't actually that loud, and really it's their caveman survival instincts which are preventing them from going to sleep, and that can't really be considered to be your fault. This may or may not work, but I encourage you to give it a go anyway. Let me know how you go in the comments. Otherwise, that's all for today, guys. Thank you for sitting through this somewhat long-winded keyboard sound comparison, and I'll see you next time.